The last thing Dora May Halsey expected on the final morning of her working life was the sound of an engine. She'd been awake since 4:30, the way she always was. 31 years of rising before the school buses made it impossible to sleep past 5, so her body had simply stopped trying. She sat at the kitchen table in her housecoat with a cup of coffee she held in both hands, not because she was cold, but because the warmth felt good in her palms. The apartment was quiet. Her daughter Simone had called the night before from Columbus, crying a little, saying she was sorry she could not be there in person. Dora May had told her not to be foolish. It was just a job, she said, and she had believed it when she said it. She was not sure she believed it now. She had started at Garfield Elementary School on a Tuesday in September, the year she was 34 years old. Her husband Roy had been gone 3 years by then, cancer taking him faster than either of them had thought possible, and she had 2 daughters still at home and a rent payment that did not care about grief. She had applied for the position because a woman at her church named Gloria had mentioned that the school was hiring, and because Dora May was a person who had always believed that a job worth doing was a job worth showing up to, and this one at least involved feeding people, which was something she understood. The cafeteria manager at Garfield, a wide woman named Fern who smelled of cinnamon rolls and spoke in a voice built for a larger room, had hired her on the spot. Dora May could cook, she could show up, and she had a face that did not make children nervous. That was the whole job description, Fern told her. Everything else was teachable. 31 years, more than 11,000 school days. She had stirred pots of macaroni in weather so cold that the service corridor frosted over, and in heat so thick the servers stripped down to their undershirts by 10 in the morning. She had worn through 8 pairs of non-slip kitchen shoes and 4 hairnets and more aprons than she had ever tallied. She had outlasted 4 principals, 2 renovation projects, 1 asbestos scare, and a pandemic that had sent all the children home and left her spending 6 months packing meal boxes in a parking lot, in a hairnet and a paper mask, handing food through car windows to families she had watched cross that cafeteria line for a decade. What she had not outlasted was the children. They came and went in waves, as children do, cycling through in 5-year arcs, and for the first 20 years or so, she had held the separations loosely because there were always new ones arriving to fill the lunch trays and argue about pizza day. At some point, though, the ones who were leaving had started to come back. Not as children, as people. A young man in a mail carrier uniform stopping her in the parking lot of the grocery store. A woman with a stroller who waved across a gas station and jogged over to grab her by both hands. A teenager who had once cried at her lunch counter because his mother was sick, and who was now a line cook at a restaurant 3 blocks from the school, and who, she later learned, had mailed Fern's replacement a card every Christmas for 5 years saying the cafeteria was the reason he had ever cared about food. She didn't know about the card until much later. She did not know about most of what she had left behind. If you have ever watched a woman spend 31 years feeding children who did not belong to her, you know the particular invisible weight of that work. It is not dramatic. It is not what anyone calls a calling. It is a hairnet and a ladle and a line that moves, and a voice that says good morning to 100 small faces before most of the city has finished its first cup of coffee. It is a work that the world does not build statues to. And Dora May had never asked it to. She had simply showed up 5 days a week, 9 months a year, and put food on plates and learned faces and remembered, because remembering cost nothing, that Kayan hated the green beans but ate 2 servings of corn, that Alia's lunch account was almost always short on Fridays, that the new boy who had transferred in from somewhere far away and did not speak much English would sometimes look up from his tray and offer the smallest nod, and that a nod from a child who didn't yet have the words was as close to a thank you as anything she had ever received. She did not think of herself as special. That is the honest truth of it, and it matters to say it plainly. She went to work because the work was there and the bills were real. The love came later, the way it usually does in lives that are lived rather than performed. By the time she understood that she was doing something more than a job, she was already most of the way through it, and the only thing left to do was finish. Today was the finish. She rinsed her cup and dressed carefully, the way she always dressed for Fridays. Navy slacks, a cream blouse with a small collar, her good walking shoes, the ones she wore outside the kitchen. She stood in the mirror for a moment and did the thing she'd been doing in mirrors since Roy died, which was simply to look at her own face until it looked familiar again. Then she picked up her bag and went out to her car. The drive to Garfield Elementary took 11 minutes. She had made it so many thousands of times that her hands moved the wheel without her thinking about it, and her mind drifted, the way it does on routes the body knows by heart. She thought about Simone and about her older daughter Kezia in Atlanta, who had also called, who had also cried, who had made Dora May promise to call the moment she got home. She thought about the macaroni recipe she had finally gotten right in year 14, the one the kids had dubbed Mrs. D's Mac, even though no one ever called her Mrs. D to her face. She thought about Fern, who had retired years before her and who sent a card every Christmas, and about the way cafeteria work smelled at 7 in the morning, industrial and warm and oddly hopeful. She parked in her usual spot. The lot was half full already. She walked through the side entrance, past the coat hooks and the nurse's office, and into the cafeteria. They had decorated it. Paper streamers in gold and green, the school colours, ran from the serving counter to the window frames. Handmade cards covered the bulletin board, 24 of them at least, construction paper in every colour, written in the crayon-pressed loops and tilted letters of children who were still learning the size of words. Someone had baked a cake, white with yellow frosting, and her name spelled out in careful purple letters. The morning custodian, a quiet man named Hector who had worked at Garfield for 6 years and who spoke to Dora May every morning at 6:45 with the precision of a person who wanted to be sure she was heard, was standing by the counter with his arms folded and his eyes a little too bright. The current cafeteria manager, a young woman named Brianna, who had taken over 4 years ago and who had told Dora May plainly in her first week that she intended to learn everything Dora May knew before Dora May left, stood behind the serving counter with a wooden spoon she appeared to be holding for no particular reason. "You're early," Brianna said. "I am always early," Dora May said. The morning moved the way final mornings always move when you love a place, which is to say, both faster and slower than it should. She tied on her apron. She helped portion the breakfast trays. She stood at the counter when the doors opened and she put food on the plates of children who had spent a day not fully understanding what was ending. Because children rarely do, because the world seems permanent to the young. One boy named Derek, who was 8 and very serious, set his tray down, looked at her and said, "Mrs. D, is it true you're leaving?" And she said yes, and he said, "That's not good," and picked up his tray and carried it to his table with the gravity of someone bearing bad news. She laughed so suddenly she had to press her hand to her mouth. The morning teachers came by in 1s and 2s. The school counsellor, Ms. Tremblay, who had worked at Garfield for 12 years and who Dora May suspected cried at most things, arrived with a small envelope and a hug that lasted slightly too long. The third-grade teacher, Mr. Okafor, brought a card signed by his entire class that contained at least 9 different spellings of the word miss. The principal, a steady woman named Dr. Whitfield, who had been at the school for 3 years and who had, in that time, made a point of eating in the cafeteria every single Friday, came by at 10 o'clock and shook Dora May's hand and then, abandoning formality, hugged her. By mid-morning, the cafeteria had settled into its familiar midday rhythm, the clatter of trays on the return rack, the hiss of the industrial sprayer, the particular smell of institutional dish soap cutting through the last of the morning's warmth. Dora May had worked in that smell for so long that she no longer noticed it on her clothing, but she noticed it now the way you notice a sound that is about to go silent. She stood at her usual station and ran the lunch count and thought about all the times she had stood in exactly that spot and looked out at the cafeteria tables and done the same mental inventory she had always done, knowing without being told which child had not eaten breakfast, which one had come in with red eyes from crying, which one needed an extra roll set beside their tray without remark. She had never written any of it down. None of it existed anywhere except in the accumulated quiet weight of 31 years of showing up. She was the only record of it. And she was about to retire. She thought that it was enough to have done it, and she believed it, mostly. By 11, Dora May was beginning to believe the day would end the way she had expected, warmly, quietly, with a piece of yellow cake and a drive home. She was wrong, and she did not know she was wrong, and that gap between what she knew and what was already in motion was exactly the kind of thing that closes like a door and leaves a person standing in a different room than the one they entered. There is something I should tell you now because you deserve to understand what Dora May could not see. In the spring of 2007, a boy named Marcus came through Dora May's lunch line. He was 9 years old, small for his age, with a gap in his front teeth and a coat that was at least 2 sizes too large and was clearly someone else's coat, worn not for style but for warmth in the kind of way that tells you a family is in a hard season. He put his tray at the end of the counter and opened the small paper envelope that held his lunch account number, and the envelope was empty. Not low. Empty. He stood there for a moment and did not speak, and Dora May watched him do the small interior arithmetic that children in that situation do, the calculation of what it costs to say out loud that you cannot pay. She put a full lunch on his tray. She did not make a note of it. She did not ask him his name. She just put the food in front of him and moved the line along. That would have been the end of it, except that it was not. Marcus came through her line 3 more times that year with an empty account. Each time she fed him. She never said a word about it to him, and she never said a word about it to anyone. By the time Marcus left Garfield Elementary for the middle school 2 years later, she had long since stopped keeping count. There had been others. There were always others. She paid for lunches out of her own pocket more times than she could have totaled, because she made it a policy not to total them, because a policy of counting how much kindness costs tends to make you stop being kind. Marcus did not forget. He left Garfield Elementary carrying the lunch Dora May had given him, and he carried the memory of it forward through middle school and high school and every other institution that came after, the way you carry a thing that was given to you without conditions, which is to say, carefully and without being entirely certain why. His home life evened out some as he got older. His mother, a woman named Darlene, who worked a split shift at a dry cleaning plant, had always been someone who tried, and eventually her trying lined up with a stretch of better circumstances. And things got steadier. They were never easy, but they were steadier. Marcus grew up with a particular quality of attention that children from hard houses often develop, a habit of noticing what was given and what was withheld, and what had been given anyway without being asked. He went to public school, then to a community college in the next county, on a partial scholarship he had earned by working nights at a fulfillment warehouse while maintaining a grade point average that astonished his advisor. He did not sleep much during those years. He kept a spiral notebook on the passenger seat of the second-hand car he shared with his mother on alternating days, and he did his homework in the parking lot of the warehouse during his 30-minute break under the yellow security lights, sitting in the front seat with the heater running. His advisor told him he should transfer to a 4-year school. He told her he would when he was ready. He was ready at 20. He transferred and studied logistics because he understood from early on that the movement of things through the world, the getting of what is needed to where it is needed, was the machinery underneath everything else. He had understood this since he was 9 years old, in a cafeteria, watching a woman put a tray of food in front of him before he had to ask for it. He had not had the vocabulary for it then, but the understanding had been there, a seed, waiting for a name. He graduated on a Thursday in May, and the first thing he did after the ceremony was drive to his mother's apartment and sit at her kitchen table and eat the meal she had cooked for the occasion. He got a job. He worked hard in the way that people work when they understand that the work is not just work, but a proof. He also rode motorcycles. He had started riding at 22 the year he moved into his own apartment, because he had spent a childhood in the back seat of cars belonging to other people, and he wanted, for the first time, to choose his own direction at speed. He joined a club called the Road Guardians, a group of black men and women in their 20s and 30s who rode together on weekends and organised toy drives in the winter and school supply collections in the fall. They wore matching vests and rode in formation and were not, despite what the old movies suggested, frightening to anyone who actually knew them. Marcus had told her story at a Road Guardians meeting 4 years ago, not as a plan, but as something he needed to say, the way you sometimes need to say the thing you've been carrying before the weight of it becomes permanent. The club met twice a month in the back room of a sportsman's bar on the east side, a space that smelled of old vinyl and fried food, and that the owner, a member named Gerald, who had ridden for 20 years and held the space at no charge for the group, had hung with framed photographs of club rides going back to the 90s. There were 14 people at that meeting. Marcus had been secretary that year, which meant he ran the agenda, which meant he occasionally went off agenda when something needed saying. He had been talking about the kind of work that goes unrecognised, the kind that keeps a whole world running without anyone stopping to make note of it, and at some point he had told them about the second grade. He told it simply, the way the true ones go. The coat, too big, the empty envelope, the woman who had looked at him and put a plate of food in front of him without a word of explanation or expectation. The room had been quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something true has been said out loud. Gerald had set his glass down. Priya, the hospital administrator, had looked at Marcus for a moment after he finished and said nothing. The right kind of nothing. No one had suggested anything. Not that night, The idea had come later, the way ideas of that kind usually do, surfacing slowly from a conversation that should have ended, but did not. Marcus had mentioned offhandedly that he had gone back to Garfield Elementary the previous spring, just to see the building, and had looked it up and found that she was still there, still working, and that she was going to retire at the end of this school year. One of the women in the club, a hospital administrator named Priya, who had grown up in the same neighbourhood as Marcus and who had heard his story more than once, had said, "Well, then we should do something." And they had done something. They had made calls. The Road Guardians knew other clubs because that was how riding worked, a community of communities, and the community was larger than most people imagined. They reached out to the Steel Hearts Club from the next city over. They called the Veterans Riders, a group that included men and women who had served and who came back from service with the deep, specific knowledge of what it means to show up for something that asks everything and offers little in return. They contacted the women's riding group called the Throttle Sisters, who were known in 3 counties for showing up at events people needed them at, and whose presence always carried a kind of quiet declaration that you were seen. By the time the calls were done, the number was 82 riders. 82 people who had not met her, most of them who were not connected to Garfield Elementary, most of them who were coming because a man named Marcus had told a story about a woman who had fed him without asking his name, and that story had sounded to each of them like something worth honouring. The school administration had known for a week. Dr. Whitfield had known. Brianna had known. The teachers, most of them, had known. They had agreed without being asked to say nothing. Not because the secret was dramatic, but because some gifts need to be given whole without the recipient spending the days before them filling the gift with their own expectations. Dora May knew nothing. She knew nothing at 1 o'clock when the afternoon service ended and she untied her apron for the last time. She stood holding it for a moment before she hung it on the hook. It was a plain white apron with the school's name stenciled in faded green across the bib, and it had been washed so many times the cotton had gone soft and translucent at the hem, and there was a small ink stain near the pocket that had been there since 2018 and had never fully come out. She had no particular attachment to the apron. She was not sentimental about objects as a general matter. She hung it up. She stood looking at the cafeteria for a long moment while Brianna pretended to count inventory nearby and Hector very carefully mopped the same section of floor 3 times. She knew nothing at 1:15 when Dr. Whitfield appeared at the cafeteria door and said, "Dora May, before you go, we'd like you to come outside." "Outside?" Dora May said. "The staff wants to see you off," Dr. Whitfield said, and her voice was steady and professional, which was an achievement under the circumstances. Dora May picked up her bag and her good coat from the hook beside the door and put on the coat the way she always did. Right arm first, then left, settling it at the collar. She had done that for 31 years in this building, and she did it now the same way. Out of muscle memory, because her hands did not yet know this was the last time. Brianna was standing near the door. Hector was there too, his mop handle leaning against the wall, his cap in his hands. She thanked them both. Brianna said she was going to call her in a few months to check in, and Dora May said she expected that and would be waiting. Hector said very quietly that it had been an honour. She told him the honour was hers, and meant it. The school counsellor walked beside Dora May. 2 teachers flanked her from behind. They moved through the side hallway and out through the main entrance, and as they walked, Dora May noticed that the hallway was unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that exists when people are holding it, and she glanced at the counsellor's face, and the counsellor smiled back at her with the particular brightness of someone maintaining composure through direct effort. Dora May thought that something was happening. She did not yet know what. She stepped through the door and then stopped, because what she saw made stopping the only available response. They were lined up along the street in front of the school, and they stretched further in both directions than she could see clearly. Motorcycles, 82 of them, engines idling, riders in vests and helmets sitting upright in their seats, and the sound of all of them together was something that could be felt as much as heard. A low rumble that moved through the soles of her feet and up through her chest. The riders nearest to her had their helmets off, and she could see their faces. Most of them were strangers. One of them was not. Marcus was standing next to his bike near the front of the line, and he was 31 years old now, and he was taller than she would have guessed, and he had his helmet under his arm and was watching her face with the expression of someone who has been waiting a long time for a moment to arrive and is now watching it arrive. and she looked at him and did not know him. She looked for a long moment. He waited. He was patient in the way of people who have decided to be, who have made a deliberate choice to stand in a moment and not rush it, who understand that what happens next cannot be forced and should not be. He held his helmet under his arm and he looked at her and she looked at him, and she tried to find in his face the thread of something familiar, the way you do when you are meeting someone you should know and you are trying to locate the person inside the years. And then she saw it, the gap in his front teeth. Still there, after all those years, that slight parting in the upper row that she had noticed in the second grade because she noticed things about children, it was a habit she had never been able to turn off. The same gap, the same slight tilt of the head that boys sometimes carry into manhood without knowing it. Her mind went back through 3 decades to a boy with an empty lunch envelope and a coat too big for his shoulders and eyes that were working very hard not to show what they felt, and the present and the past rearranged themselves around each other until they fit. And she understood. She pressed her hand to her mouth. She did not speak. Marcus walked toward her and he said, "Mrs. D." And then he said, "You probably don't remember me." And she shook her head because she had no words yet, and he said, "My name is Marcus Hall. I came through your line in second grade with no money in my account, and you fed me anyway. You never made me feel like I owed you anything." He paused. "I've owed you something for 22 years. The school counsellor, Miss Tremblay, who Dora May had suspected, cried at most things, was correct. Dora May could not speak. She stood with her hand over her mouth and her eyes full, and around her the teachers were silent, and behind her the children who had pressed to the school windows were watching, because children understand, even when they lack the vocabulary, that they are witnessing something real. Marcus said, "All these people came because I told them your story. Every one of them knows what you did, and we want to ride you home if you'll let us." She lowered her hand. Her voice, when it came, was very quiet. "I fed a boy lunch," she said. Marcus looked at her for a moment. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "You fed a lot of us." If you have ever had the experience of being seen, truly seen, after a long time of going unremarked, you know that it does not feel the way the stories say it does. It does not feel triumphant. It feels like something being set down. Like you have been carrying a thing that you did not know you were carrying, and someone has noticed the weight of it and reached out and taken some of it from you. And the relief of it is enormous and quiet and a little like grief, because you realize how long you have been holding it. Dora May Halsey stood in the parking lot of the school where she had spent 31 years, and she let herself be seen. Someone had brought her car around to the front. Dr. Whitfield pressed the keys into her hand. Hector, who had been standing at the edge of the group, gave a small nod in his precise and careful way, and she returned it. She got into her car. She pulled out of the parking lot, and 82 motorcycles formed up behind her, and ahead of her and around her, the sound of them enormous and layered, a sound that she felt in her ribs and in the steering wheel under her palms, and she drove home through streets she had driven 1,000 times. At the first intersection, a police cruiser had pulled across the oncoming lane to hold the cross-traffic back, and the officer stood next to his car and watched the procession pass and took off his hat. She did not know if anyone had arranged for that or if it had simply happened, the way certain things happen when enough people gather for a reason the world recognizes as real. She passed the elementary school 2 blocks north, a different school from Garfield, where small children were coming out at the end of their day, and a teacher standing at the gate looked up at the sound and then grabbed the hand of the nearest child and pointed. She passed the diner where she sometimes stopped on Fridays after her shift, and the owner, a Greek man named Stavros, who had given her free coffee every first Friday of the month for 12 years without either of them ever discussing it, was standing in the doorway with his dish towel, and he lifted one hand as she passed. She did not know if he knew. She thought probably not. She thought it did not matter. People stopped on the sidewalk. A man in a delivery uniform stood next to his truck with his hand pressed flat against his heart. 2 women outside a laundromat watched, and then one of them pointed and said something to the other, and they both began to applaud, not knowing the story, just understanding that whatever this was, it was something that deserved to be applauded. Dora May drove, and she cried, not loudly but steadily, in the way you cry when you're not sad, but when the thing you've been too busy to feel has finally found you sitting still long enough to arrive. Have you ever known someone who gave without keeping count? If you have, drop their name in the comments. The world needs to know they exist. She pulled into the parking lot of her apartment complex, and the motorcycles followed her in, and they idled in a loose arc as she put her car in park, and Marcus rode up alongside her window and gave her a thumbs up, and she laughed through the tears and gave one back. They stayed for a while. Not long, but long enough. People got off their bikes and removed their helmets, and the parking lot became something different from what it had been. Not a parking lot anymore, but a gathering, the specific kind of gathering that forms around a moment that was worth witnessing. Someone had brought a small folding table and a cooler of water bottles. Introductions were made, names she would not remember by the next morning, but that felt necessary to hear in the moment. A tall woman from the Throttle Sisters named Vera shook her hand and held it for a beat longer than a handshake requires, and said, simply, "We see you." A veteran named Curtis, who had retired from the Marines 4 years prior and who wore his club vest over a collared shirt, told her that his grandmother had been a school cafeteria worker for 23 years in Birmingham and had never once been thanked by anyone in an official capacity. He said it without self-pity, as a statement of fact. She said she was sorry, and he said there was nothing to be sorry for now. She shook hands with more strangers than she could track, each of them saying some version of the same thing, that they had heard her story, or that Marcus had told them, or simply that they were glad to be there. She was not sure what to do with that. She said, "You're welcome," because that was what you said, and because the alternative was to keep explaining that she had just fed a child. And she could see that explaining it was not the point. The point was that someone had been watching, even when she did not know it. The point was that the work she had done in that cafeteria, the work that did not make the news and did not go in anyone's records and did not earn her anything beyond her regular wage, had mattered in a way that had travelled through years and distance and come back to her on a Friday afternoon in 82 motorcycles and a man with a gap in his teeth. Before Marcus left, she asked him what he did for work. He told her he managed supply chain operations for a non-profit that delivered food to schools in underserved areas across the state. They worked with 32 schools currently, he said, and were adding 6 more in the spring. The work involved making sure the food was funded and sourced and moving, and that when a school's budget fell short in the fourth quarter, as it often did, there was already a reserve in place, so no cafeteria line stopped and no child stood at a counter with an empty account and did the interior arithmetic of what it costs to ask for what you need. He said it in a simple, matter-of-fact way, as if it were only a job. She looked at him for a long moment. The late afternoon light had shifted while they were talking, the way light does in November, going soft and amber and low, and it fell across the parking lot and across his face. And she could see in him, if she looked directly, the boy from the second grade and the man standing in front of her at the same time, the way you can sometimes hold 2 things in sight at once if you do not try to separate them. "That's right," she said softly, not asking. He understood what she meant. He nodded once, and his jaw tightened the way a man's jaw tightens when he is trying to hold something in. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "That's right." Kindness does not stop with the person you give it to. It moves. It takes root in someone else's ground and grows into something that person carries out into the world and plants somewhere new. And by the time it comes back to you, you barely recognize what you started. But it is yours. It was always yours. The last motorcycle left her parking lot at 3:45 in the afternoon. She stood at her kitchen window and watched the final few round the corner and disappear, the sound of them fading slowly until it was just the ordinary sound of the neighbourhood again. Traffic, a dog, somebody's lawnmower 2 buildings over. She took off her coat and hung it on the peg behind the door. She filled the kettle and set it on the stove and stood with her back against the counter while it heated, looking at the kitchen she had lived in for 11 years. The refrigerator had a photograph of Simone's daughters on it, held by a magnet from a museum she had visited on a field trip 8 years ago and never returned. There was a dish drying by the sink and by the four. There was a grocery list on the notepad by the phone that still had milk and butter and a box of cornmeal on it, things she had been meaning to get for a week and had not gotten because the week had been a final week of work and her attention had been elsewhere. She would get them tomorrow. She had time now for the grocery store on a weekday. That thought sat in her chest for a moment in a way she had not expected. She had time. She called Simone first because Simone had cried the night before and deserved to know. She got through about 45 seconds of the story before Simone started crying again, and Dora May had to stop and wait, patting the phone against her palm while her daughter collected herself. Then she called Kezia in Atlanta, and Kezia made a sound that was not quite a word, and Dora May said, "I know." And Kezia said, "Mama, I told you." And Dora May said, "You told me nothing like this." And Kezia laughed. She sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee she held in both hands, the same way she had sat that morning in the dark before the city was awake. The afternoon light was coming through the window at the particular angle it came in late autumn, low and golden and clear, and it landed on the table and on her hands, and she sat in it for a while without moving. On the table, her phone showed 4 missed calls and a dozen text messages from numbers she did not recognize, people who had been in the parking lot and had somehow gotten her contact through the school, she supposed, all of them saying variants of the same thing. She would answer them later. Right now, she sat. She thought about Roy the way she always thought about Roy at the end of important days, as if some part of her still expected to be able to tell him. She thought he would have laughed because Roy had a particular laugh for things that surprised him, a short, delighted sound that meant he had not seen that coming. And he had not been a man who was often caught off guard. She thought he would have said something like, "Dora May, you never told me you were somebody." And she would have said, "I always told you. You just weren't listening." She thought about the macaroni recipe, and the 8 pairs of non-slip shoes, and the boy with the empty lunch envelope who had grown into a man who managed the logistics of feeding children in schools across the state. And she thought about how none of it had been an accident. How each of those things connected to each of the others in ways she could not have seen from the inside of any individual moment. 31 years, more than 11,000 days, 100 faces a day, every day. She had not counted it as anything, and it had been everything. The light through the window moved as it always moved, the way all light moves, westward and slow, and the kitchen was very quiet, and she sat in the good, warm middle of what she had made, and rested. If this story moved you, let it know in the comments. For another story about the kind of quiet faithfulness the world forgets and then can't do without, stay right here. This is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. The characters, events, and school depicted are not real.